Good morning, everyone. Hey, this is Zach Edwards with another episode of the Adventure Box podcast, brought to you by Historical Conquest. Now, today we're going to be talking about something really exciting. This is when the battles start really coming together for the French and Indian War. Last week we talked about Europe, what was happening in Europe during the 7 Years' War, the exact same time as the French and Indian War, which is just another part of the 7 Years' War. Okay, so what's really fascinating about this is strategy. So how would the French and Indian War be won, but by strategy? You had the British, who had basically the south, everything south of St. Lawrence River, give or take. And then you had the French that had everything north of the St. Lawrence River. But the French started to creep in to the Ohio Valley. We talked about this again 2 weeks ago, before we talked about the European conflict. Now, because of what was happening with the French starting to trickle down into British territory, at least the British saw it as British territory, it was actually unclaimed because it wasn't part of the 13 colonies. And so the French thought, well, we should be able to be here. Oh, enchanté. We should have this place. But the British, yes, this is our area. You shall not claim this. These are just two different civilizations that basically wanted this land for themselves, but it was not actually theirs. At the time, there were two people that really could be said to have ownership of it. I say that loosely because neither of them really had ownership of it. There were the Native Americans. They were occupying the land. And there were the colonists who came in and lived there. Now, the British were in Europe. Yes, they did have British troops, and they did have British subjects, and they claimed the area to be theirs. But was it really? Not really. Sometimes they bought the land from the Native Americans. That you could actually say is, that could be their land. The French, when they bought it from the Native Americans, that could be their land, except for the fact that even the Native Americans did not see it as their territory. Most of the Native American areas, most of the Native Americans before Columbus, before the French and Indian War, were nomadic. They moved around. Now, they did have territories. They had areas where they wanted to be able to claim. But the fact is that they actually came in as well to a land that was, most of the time, already occupied, and they took over that land as well. So, now, let's put all that to the side. However you feel about who owned the land, who occupied the land, doesn't matter. What does matter is what was happening during that time. So you have the Native Americans who they see the British and the French, two opponents of each other, both with guns, both with ironworks. The Native Americans did not have those things, so they knew in order to survive, they had to side with one of the two bullies, one of the two people that came into their land, and they had to claim that part of the land. Okay, so at this time, they could not claim what the British had already came in and taken. So in order to stay alive, especially because the Native Americans were always fighting themselves, different tribes and such, different confederacies, different nations, they were all fighting each other for territory, for area. And so when the British and the French came over, they said, we got to side with one of them. So you had the Algonquin. They were more in the north, or in most like Canada and down through the Great Lakes. And you had the Iroquois, which was also in the same types of area. Now the Algonquin was actually a group of tribes that came together. So was the Iroquois Confederacy. They were a group of tribes that came together. Mohawks and such. All of these groups, they basically had to side with their own, before they sided with the British and French, they had to side with their own confederacies. So a lot of the same things are happening at the exact same time between the Europeans and the Native Americans. So with all that being said, let's go a little bit more deeper into it. They were worried that they were going to be taken over. The only way to not be taken over, whether by the other Native Americans or by the Europeans, was to side with one side of the Europeans. We talked about this last week. The same thing happened in Europe. You had Austria, who first sided with the British, and then they changed to the French. So during the War of Austrian Succession, they were with the British. During the 7 Years' War, they sided with the French. So they switched sides. Again, it was all based upon their survival and their success. The Native Americans had the same thing. We had to side with one of them. Algonquins, French. The Iroquois Confederacy, British. Now they had other ones that were not part of those two groups that would join on as well. This is why it was called the French and Indian War. Now why it wasn't called the French and British and Indian War, who knows? I don't know. That's just how they wrote it in history. But the war was basically to kick out the French. The British were the ones that wrote the records recording it. There were some French records too, but a lot of the British records. So I guess if you're writing the history and you're the successor, you really get to name it, right? Okay. Anyways, let's go on. So here's what's happening. So let me bring up my notes because I want to make sure I have all these things accurate. I have a really big qualm about people and accuracy. Sometimes I might get something wrong. I will correct it as soon as I find out about it. But that's why I have notes. So I'll be reading some of my notes while discussing this. We're first going to talk about one place though. This is Fort Louisbourg. Right, this place, right here. Okay. Now, as you can see, they're on the very tip of this land, on a peninsula. And they have a wall that comes around them to keep them safe. Now, this is, again, what it looks like nowadays. This is not what it looked like back then. But I'll show you the picture in just a second. So, where is this piece of land? Oh, wait a second. It's not in America. It's not in the United States. Sorry. It's on the end of, basically, like, Nova Scotia. There's Nova Scotia. Now, if you don't know where Nova Scotia is, go to the eastern point of Maine and just swim west, or swim east. You swim across the ocean, that part of the ocean, you come to Nova Scotia. It's actually like connected, per se, to New Brunswick or Canada. But it's classified as an island. And on the very tip, again, oops, I lost it. On the very tip, you have this fort. Now, why did they have this fort all the way over in Nova Scotia? What is this thing right here? If you're not looking at this, if you go just north of Nova Scotia and a little bit over to the west, you go down, start going down to a river. The river is called the St. Lawrence River. The St. Lawrence River, where did it go to? It connected with two large cities. And those are in forts as well. Quebec City and Montreal. So in order for the British to come in and take this area, they can go to the northern tip and skirt by, but there's actually a fort up here, or they can go to where they're closer and take over Prince Edward Island around Nova Scotia. And so if they're able to take this area, sorry, Prince Edward Island is off of Nova Scotia. It's not actually part of it. But if they're able to take over Nova Scotia by taking over this fort, then they can have full access to the St. Lawrence River. So this was very important. So this is after the 7 Years' War starts. After the French and Indian War starts. And this was a campaign put together by the Prime Minister William Pitt over in Great Britain. So he's over in London or so. And he decides, we need to take this place. We need to take this. So he campaigns all throughout Parliament to get support. Now, Louisbourg is very strategic with getting to the St. Lawrence River, which gets to Montreal and Quebec. And so it was fairly easy to talk people into supporting this campaign. So he also garnered the help of other British officers, such as Major General Geoffrey Amherst. And also naval support. Now that was the commander of the infantry, but he also needed naval support because they were coming from the ocean, and they also needed ways to bring in the ships with the men from the army, from the British infantry, the British army. And so you had Admiral Edward, Boscawen. Boscawen. Okay, so Admiral Boscawen was heading the naval fleets. So they come in from the ocean. I'm bringing this back a little bit. They come in from the ocean, and they hit Fort Lewis very hard. So the planning and preparation was basically from April 1758 until late May of 1758. So about a month and a half. And this May is actually when the British troops actually arrived. So let's just say beginning of May 1758. So about a month worth of planning and campaigning, and they got it all together. They got it together so much that they had 150 ships. That's a lot of ships, especially back then. 150 ships and about 1,400 troops, soldiers. So they arrived at Louisbourg end of May 1758. June 8th, 1758, after bombarding the French. Now the French defenders, led by Chevalier de Drucourt, had about 3,500, again 14,000 to 3,500 soldiers, and about 5,000 sailors. They were all in this harbor that was basically protecting where? Oh, sorry, not that harbor. The harbor near Louisbourg. So they're in this harbor. But again, the naval ships could easily sail up and attack any British forces that were coming. But 150 ships, that's pretty hard to combat. And so at this point, they had to push off a little bit because of bad weather, but they hit it hard. They went straight in and attacked. And then as soon as they got some ground, they sent their ships in, that were carrying the soldiers. So they brought in their boats to go in and do that. This force was led by General James Wolfe, which you'll actually hear about a lot during the French and Indian War. And also, if I'm not mistaken, the American Revolution, but I'll get back to you on that one. Okay, so the siege operation begins basically June 11th. They go in on June 8th. They dig trenches. They create fortifications. Now, if you came into this, if you watched this, let's see. Anyways, well, we'll go back to this. Okay, so what they did was they had the British troops come in and set up fortifications. They were setting up a fort. They were setting up digging ditches in order, trenches. There you go. That's the word I was looking for, and establishing their artillery. Their artillery, of course, their cannons. The French defenses, including a fleet of ships in the harbor, were basically, they were neutralized, I guess, would be the best way of putting it, by the British Navy. The British Navy came in, landed their troops, and took out the ships in the harbor. So now it was just up to the British troops on land. Again, the 5,000 sailors were probably on those ships, in the French ships. So you only had 3,500 versus 14,000 troops. So, as you can expect, it wasn't very hard to take the walls, to take the bombardments, to take the fort. And they took it off fairly easily. This is actually the beginning of the British successes. So they've had a lot of failures all through the time. And I'm actually going to get to one that's very important at this time. We're going to go to, now I'm going to actually type this in here, Fort Duquesne. This is on the confluence of two different rivers. So you have the Monongahela River, and I don't remember which one this is. This is the Allegheny River, which then make up the Ohio River. Okay, there you go. So that's the start of the Ohio River, the confluence of those two rivers come together. And you look right at the land at the very tip of the land that comes where they come together, and there's Fort Duquesne. Now, what's significant there is that you had multiple times when the British actually tried to take them. Now, let me zoom out just a little bit. As you will see, yes, I know it's Fort Duquesne. Let's see. Close out of that. Come into here. This is Philadelphia. It's not showing you Philadelphia, but it is actually. No, sorry, no, it's Pittsburgh, not Philadelphia. It's Pittsburgh. Yeah, there you go, Pittsburgh. So that is where Fort Duquesne is. Zoom out a little bit higher, a little bit more. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, right near the start of Ohio. This is what you call the Ohio Valley. And this was actually occupied a lot by the Native Americans, but also the French forts that they built over time. Now, remember the, what was it? The Jumonville campaign? That's where the George Washington went out with British troops to tell them to stop building and go away. This is our land. Get out of here. The French said, oh, no, no. This is our land. We will protect this land. No, George Washington did not have the troops at the time. He was just delivering a message. So he was just a messenger boy. And this is about the time that he was about 25 years old. So he goes back and they say, no, no, no. You need to go back out there. You need to show them force. So Washington went out and created Fort Necessity, which was just down south from Fort Duquesne. Well, the French sent over a possible scouting party. There's a lot of men. It could have actually been a force to destroy Fort Necessity. But before he did that, you had George Washington who came up, and actually I think this was before Fort Necessity was actually built, and it was very poor. It was, go back 2 weeks, you'll see. Well, you'll see all about Fort Necessity. But George Washington came in and captured that party during the night. He did a night raid, took all the men, but something happened, and no one really knows exactly what happened. There are different accounts of it, but during that time, something happened, and Jumonville was killed. Now, who's Jumonville? Jumonville was an officer, a lower officer in the French army, but so was his brother, who was actually more influential, and he didn't like the fact that his brother was just killed. It also dishonored his family, so that brother, he was furious, so he wanted death for George Washington, and he came in, attacked Fort Necessity, took Washington prisoner, and had him sign a letter. This letter was in French, so of course George Washington could not read it, and according to them, he accepted the terms on the paper. George Washington said, I would not have signed it if I had known what it was. On that paper, it basically said that George Washington was claiming would take responsibility for the death of Jumonville. So because of that, George Washington was sent back, and because the British were actually, because they thought it was their land, they were very much insulted. This is when Braddock came out. General Braddock came out and tried to take Fort Duquesne. And before he even got there, now remember, with him was George Washington. I'm going over everything we talked about 2 weeks ago. But George Washington was with him. And he wasn't that happy because of what had happened. The embarrassment that he had because of that attack on Fort Necessity. And sadly, he would actually see another loss during the next battle, which would be the Battle of, I'm trying to remember, it's not in my notes here. Oh, sorry. Yeah, it has the same name as the river. Battle of Monongahela. Now that battle, two things happened. One, when the British started retreating because they were overtaken, Braddock was shot, mortally wounded, killed. Yet George Washington, who was riding through all of his troops, trying to get them to keep fighting, and then when they retreated, left with his troops, trying to keep them all together. And when he was done with that battle, he had 5 bullet holes all throughout his coat, and he didn't take one bullet to his actual body. So, miraculous. Interesting. Well, I wasn't there. I'd love to hear more information on it. But all we have is what's in the journals for not just George Washington, but also his troops. So, because of Fort Duquesne keeping up, basically not being able to be taken over because the battle with Braddock's expedition was actually down south because they couldn't actually get all the way up there to Fort Duquesne. Well, then came the Battle of Fort Duquesne. So the French were fortifying the Ohio Valley. They were constructing other forts. There's actually 3 other forts, I think, 2 or 3 other forts, including Fort Duquesne. Now, I didn't show you this picture. Let me show you a picture of Louisbourg. This is Louisbourg, which we just talked about on Nova Scotia. Nice little quaint area. This is potentially what it looked like. Not much when it comes to fortifications either. But they had a harbor full of French ships that were supposed to be the naval power, but the British took them over. Again, 150 ships makes it hard to stay against. But this is Fort Duquesne. This is what the French were building, and they built it up fairly fortified, so much that they didn't think they'd actually be taken. Actually, as you can see, it had a moat around it too. There you go. The French had a moat. Oh, enchanté. I mean, holy cow. Okay, so you had the British come up, and as their force came, now this one was different. This one was different because this was under the command of British General John Forbes. And he had this campaign put together, and I don't have the actual numbers. I should have had the numbers of how many troops were with him. But they had such a group of soldiers that the French saw those troops coming, and they said, heck no, no way. There's no way we can battle them. They got scared and ran. They took off. They abandoned their fort. But before they abandoned it, I mean, they couldn't carry the cannons. They couldn't carry a lot of the other things that were in there already. And they didn't want to give it to the British. So what do? They destroyed it. They burned what they could. They blew up what they could as they ran off. This was actually somewhat of a diversion as well. So the French were coming up, wanting to take this fort. It was looks like a good fort. Well, the British came up wanting to save the fort, so they went right into the fort trying to save the fort while the British made their way out. And so when the British came in, they now named it, they started rebuilding it, occupying the ruins of it, and named it Fort Pitt. After who? That's right, the Prime Minister William Pitt the Elder, who was the one that actually put the campaign together. This was the start of the end of the French and Indian War. Though it wouldn't end for years later, but this is the end of the major portion. This is like the big turning point in the British fight for the Ohio Valley. Now, when it came to Montreal, Quebec, and everything Canada, well, that was later on. That was different. But when it came to Ohio Valley, this is where the turning point was. And after this, they went after all the other forts, and things kept rocking and rolling for the British. So let me show you another picture of Fort Duquesne. This is Fort Duquesne right outside of, again, Pittsburgh. That's it right there. All it is a monument of what was actually there. Fort Duquesne, or again, Fort Pitt. Funny enough, yeah, people wanted to keep the Fort Duquesne because it had more history to it and kept the name, though it is actually both of them. And this is, again, in the United States, not in Canada. So we basically got to choose which one we actually call it. I would really like to find out why they actually called it Fort Duquesne when it was renamed Fort Pitt and the British had control over it afterwards. Could it just be because it was tradition? Everyone knew it by that? I don't know. Something we'll have to look up sometime. Okay, but this is, now, like I said, this is the turning point for the British. The British have finally said, hey, we have stopped, we are not losing every battle anymore. So after Braddock's expedition, George Washington being up there, all these things, all the other forts that they had started trying to attack, this is the turning part. So at this point, and going forward, you're going to see a lot more British successes in the New World when it comes to the French and Indian War. But that's not the end of it. Next week, we're going to be talking about Montreal and Quebec City. Those are the most interesting stories when it comes to the French and Indian War. This is only part of the Ohio Valley campaign. So stay tuned for that. That's going to be a lot of information. Now, this is Monday. On Wednesday, we're going to come back to the French Indian War. Like I said to everyone before, we have the American history on Mondays and Wednesdays. Tuesdays and Thursdays are ancient civilizations. Excuse me. Sorry about that. And so this is something we're really going to start getting into. Now, when we go into tomorrow, and so Tuesdays and Thursday, we're going to be talking about ancient Israel. Not from a biblical point of view in the sense of religion, but in a secular point of view in the sense of this is the history of them. And you'll be interested to see how much they collide, religious and, but it should. I mean, truthfully, it should. It is a religious people. And one of the largest documents is actually not, for them, it's not the Bible. It's the Torah. It's the first 5 books of Moses, and also some of their religious traditions. But we also go to the Quran for some of the information that helps support Israel's claim over Canaan. So yeah, this is really interesting, because right now you have what's happening over there right now. You have Gaza and Hamas going after Israel. Hamas going after Israel, and Israel returning the favor. So Hamas was the first to act. Israel is taking over and pushing the Hamas out, not the Gazans out. That is not their intention. The intention is to get rid of Hamas. Hamas is basically the government of Gaza, and the people of Gaza have actually accepted that. That's an issue. So now we have ancient Israel. We're going to be going back and talking about the battles that were fought during that time. Them in Egypt, them in Canaan, them being taken over by the Babylonians, the Persians, and such. So stay tuned for that as well. But then again, like I said, on Wednesday, we're going to come back to the French and Indian War, and we're going to talk about something that's very important to American history. I think this is like one of the most pivotal people in American history, and you're not going to have many people that will actually argue with that, because he helped with the French and Indian War. Then he helped with the American Revolution. I mean, major figure. And then he helped with the birth of the new nation. I'm not talking about anybody else other than George Washington. We're also going to bring up a controversial part of his life, and that was slave ownership. But there's a lot more than you know of about slave ownership, and that we're going to be talking about on Wednesday. So stay tuned. Go into that. You want to know anything about George Washington? We're going to be talking about there. If you have questions, send them to me. I would love to answer them. So stay tuned for those as well. Thanks so much for joining us on this great Monday. We will see you tomorrow with Ancient Civilizations, Ancient Israel, and then back on Wednesday for French and Indian War. So thanks so much for joining us, and we will catch you next time. Take care, everyone. Talk to you soon. Bye. If you have any comments or questions, add them to the comments below. Otherwise, we'll see you tomorrow, actually. Take care. Bye.